Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to our symposium that was conducted in May of 1996. It was a symposium and tour that dealt with the third day at Gettysburg. Of course, you know that the fighting at Gettysburg was a culmination of nearly a month-long Confederate raid into the North, in which Lee had resupplied his forces and had taken advantage of the pleasant weather and the means to get the contesting armies out of Virginia during the crop raising season that the farmers in Virginia and in the Shenandoah Valley so desperately needed. And so Lee has come and when raiding, he actually has Richard Stoddard Ewell's corps is up on the Susquehanna River outside of Harrisburg, and he has been through Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Jubal Early has pressed on to the banks of the Susquehanna as well, and James Longstreet is bringing up the rear. And generally speaking, the Confederates are moving fairly well. A.P. Hill is in the middle. And Lee is operating out of Chambersburg. When he gets word that the Federal Army has crossed the Army of the Potomac, he gets through a spy and who is looking at what's going on in the countryside, in and around, and looking from South Mountain, which is a tremendous vantage point to be able to look far in the distance, the Catoctin Mountains and so forth. And this spy, Harrison, has been able to get a sense that the entire Federal Army has now moved and is in and around Frederick, Maryland, and is deploying outward. This surprises Lee because Lee has cavalry with him, but it is not the A-team. It is folks that are basically covering his flanks as he moves up or down the valleys and has now and is using the mountains as a screen for himself. But what he's looking for is information from Jeb Stuart, who is his primary cavalry leader and who has been moving and taking a look at the Army of the Potomac from Virginia. Well, Stuart was successful in moving around McClellan's army in June of 1862. And he actually thought that he might do this again, that he might take a look, then continue on and head over and try to rejoin Lee in Maryland or in Pennsylvania. But he runs into the misfortune of an army on the move. And so as he gets caught in the movement of the Northern Army, and as he tries to avoid being involved in them, he gets further and further pushed out, and he gets further delayed in providing information to Lee and getting back to Lee. And so Lee is surprised when he finds out that George Gordon Meade is now in command of the army, because Joe Hooker had been in command the last Lee had known. And Lee realizes that with the Union Army is close to the rail network of Gettysburg and Cashtown as they are, that he better bring his forces back together. And so the orders go out for him to rejoin his forces, and the expectation is that they will rejoin around Cashtown, which is about 7 miles west of Gettysburg, and deploy and make their decision from there. Because Lee, I think, knows he's going to have to fight. He's not bringing forces back together for the purposes of just retreating. He's going to fight, and he knows he's going to have to fight fairly quickly, because once you bring an army back together, it's going to gobble all the groceries it's acquired fairly quickly, and so you're going to have to move. So he's coming back for that one encounter that he's going to get there, and he's had 2 successful days. He gets back to the battlefield quicker than Meade can bring his corps to the battlefield, and so he achieves success on July the 1st at Gettysburg. And then while not completely exploiting that success, has the an initiative on the second day at Gettysburg, and when those are partially successful, allow him the high ground he's looking for around where the peach orchard is, which is the platform he was looking basically to blast the conical hill that was Cemetery Hill and the parallel ridges coming off of, but he's mostly focused on the federal epicenter at Cemetery Hill. Lee has gotten that position, so he thinks that one more stroke he will be able to achieve what he's doing, which would be to destroy the Union Army and cut the lines of communication back to Baltimore and Washington, and thus force the Federal Army to fight on open ground where Lee feels he would have an advantage. So this is how Gettysburg unfolds. And in putting this program together, we have about 5 lectures that are tied to this, and we subsequently did tours with Ed Bars that were tied to this as well. But what I'm going to do, this first lecture is going to focus on the transition point of the campaign. Frank O'Reilly is a well-known and very accomplished historian at Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania National Battlefield. He was there at that time, and while much younger at that time, he's a Washington Lee University graduate. Frank had worked with Bill Matter and had done a decisive work on the battles of Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1862, and had a strong affinity for Stonewall Jackson, the Army in Northern Virginia. He had been mentored under the tutelage of Greg Mertz and the chief historian there, Bob Crick. And so Frank is a very fine historian. Subsequently, I think he had a head of hair at this time, this 25 years ago. He's subsequently given up all that and has become a perfect man, very bald, but still bright and innovative. I asked him to open this series of lectures, and he's going to talk for about an hour and answer questions on the decision to stay and fight the third day. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy Frank O'Reilly.
And I'd like to say, good job, Chief. Well done. I'd also like to take the opportunity on behalf of the historians and the staff at Fredericksburg Spotsylvania National Military Park to extend my congratulations to Diane and officially welcome you into the family. It's her commitment to stay that leads into what I would consider the commitment of the Union Army to this day at Gettysburg and to battle it out. Because this was going to be a difficult time in the history of the Army of the Potomac. It was about midnight. As many soldiers kept watch on the battlefield, others tried to gain a little sleep. The General Gouverneur K. Warren curled up and went to sleep. And a coven of generals and corps commanders gathered to discuss the fate and the future of the Army of the Potomac. The commander of the Army, accompanied by his chief of staff, Daniel Butterfield, brought these corps commanders together at his headquarters. And he made it very obvious to them that he thought that the Army had been badly worsted in the last couple days of fighting, and that it was time for the Army to retreat. And then he and his chief of staff withdrew and left the corps commanders to make the ultimate decision for whether they should stay or if they should go. I'm not talking about the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm not talking about George Gordon Meade. I'm talking about Joseph Hooker in the ominous wilderness of Virginia near a country crossroads called Chancellorsville in May of 1863. The corps commanders who gathered that evening were 5. The first corps was led by John Fulton Reynolds. The second corps by a gentleman named Darius Snatcher Kelch. The third corps, Daniel Edgar Sickles. The fifth corps, George Gordon Meade. And the 11th Corps led by Oliver Otis Howard. The only one missing is the 12th Corps commander, Henry Slocum. Slocum was late in getting to this meeting, and it would break up before he arrived. Of these corps commanders, 3 of them were adamant that they should not only stay, but that in fact they should attack. And they were led by the most passionate of all 3, George Gordon Meade. Meade was an advocate of the attack from the start. He had been going over this for several days, begging, pleading with General Hooker to go forward. But Hooker had shied away from the contact and had fallen back. Meade made such a passionate plea that 1st Corps Commander John Fulton Reynolds had to admit that his troops had not been engaged yet. So he didn't feel at liberty to make a decision for the rest of the group. However, he was of like mind with Meade. Oliver Otis Howard made the 3rd of our triumvirate. His corps had been badly worsted on May 2nd. Embarrassed, he thought this was the only opportunity in which the corps could reclaim some of its lost elan and esprit. Only Daniel Edgar Sickles, some would call a Tammany Hall politico, others literally called him a toady of General Hooker, would stay loyal to his friend and argue that the army should retreat. The second in command of the army, Darius Couch, had to admit that it was better to stay and fight it out. But he had no confidence in Hooker, and as long as Hooker was at the helm, no good could come of it. He voted to retreat. Still, the vote hung on a 3-2 vote that the army stay. When Hooker heard this, he made the ultimate decision and said that the army would retreat, regardless of his corps commander's thoughts. As this council broke up near midnight on May 4th or May 5th, 6th, Reynolds was aroused out of a slight slumber, and as he wiped his eyes and left, he was heard to say, "What was the use in calling us together at this time of night, when he intended to retreat anyhow?" And the Battle of Chancellorsville was over. The army would retreat within the next 24 hours and return to its camps around Fredericksburg and Falmouth. Within another 24 hours, the critics would have full field. The Army's initial impression was to blame Hooker for everything. He had let the Army down. Everyone was visibly distraught at how he had talked so big before the battle, yet had performed so poorly. George Gordon Meade wrote that the Battle of Chancellorsville was a miserable failure in which Hooker disappointed Meade greatly. It was personal to him. General Winfield Scott Hancock wrote to his wife, "I understand that the opinion of the officers in high rank at this time would be unpalatable." Hooker's day is over. Even the chief of artillery for the Union First Corps, Charles Wainwright, something of a nattering nabob himself, would write that my feelings were divided between shame for my commanding general and indignation. Nearly all are very bitter on Hooker right now. In fact, the criticisms were so venomous that within another 24 hours, the President of the United States, accompanied by the General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, came down and joined the Army of the Potomac to see it firsthand. As Lincoln will put it, he wanted to see corps commanders. All these men were brought together to join the President. They even had lunch together and spent several hours before the President went back. But George Gordon Meade was rather miffed, because he said as they talked about many things, not once did they talk about the late operations. Not once had the corps commanders been asked for their opinions. And Lincoln left. Everyone around Meade's camp thought that the writing was on the wall, that Hooker would be sustained. But in fact, what Meade had missed is that a number of corps commanders were going to take advantage of the President, not to speak out in front of public, but to speak to him privately. The second in command, Darius Couch, was perhaps the most adamant at this point. Taking the President aside, he said he would not serve under Hooker again. But he would serve under anyone, including a junior officer who showed a little spine and back. He would serve under George Meade, decidedly his junior. In fact, this was going to be something that will be echoed by several other officers. John Fulton Reynolds at one point will be queried if he wants to take the command of the Army of the Potomac. He did not. However, he would be happy to serve under Meade, who he thought was a good man. Another who shared this conviction was John Sedgwick of the Union Sixth Corps, a man who wasn't at the council because his troops were nearly surrounded, almost 6 miles away from the battlefield at Chancellorsville. They had to fight an independent action just to keep from being annihilated. Couch got his wish. He did not serve under Hooker further. In fact, he was removed from command by June 9th. And the Corps went to Winfield Scott Hancock. As to the others who were constantly bickering and fighting, the blame started to grow and immerse almost the entire Army in it. And the problems in the hierarchy of the Army of the Potomac were reflected throughout the entire ranks. As one looks at the Army of the Potomac in the spring and the early summer of 1863, we are looking at the shambles, or the shadow, of a fine army. This army had been steeped now, unfortunately, in a history of losing. As they look back over their past and they try to count their accomplishments, they're few and far between. And this affects how they perceive themselves and how they perceive their enemies. They actually get a mindset at one point where they believe that the Confederates are entirely and utterly superior to them in every facet of soldiery. Such soldiers as Francis Barlow of Massachusetts, division commander in the 11th Corps, will say that the Confederate tone was in every way superior to our own. Charles Francis Adams of the Headquarters Guard and also the grandson of the President, John Quincy Adams, a man who is rather acerbic in most of his views and didn't like anyone, would have to admit that he liked the Confederates. As he is going to be in charge of many prisoners during the Gettysburg campaign, he will see them from every state, and he will say that they are well clothed, that they were well fed, they were well officered, and again, coming back to that all-important word, they had a superior tone about them. In every way, manner, shape, they were better soldiers than we. Now, as the Army of the Potomac looked at itself and how it had performed at Chancellorsville, it had to admit that it did not fight up to what it considered its own potential, that the soldiers had let themselves down, and that they felt that they had not lived up to their views. Not only had Hooker let them down, but the soldiers, the generals underneath them, the corps commanders, the division commanders had let them down. And the soldiers reflected that on the field as they didn't fight with the vigor or the vehemence that Hooker had craved, or so he said he craved from his troops. The soldiers did not give 100%, and they were ready to admit it themselves. Alexander Webb, who you'll hear a lot more about from Wally Seward this week, is going to tell us that the soldiers will not fight under fools, that they need an officer of great mind and intellect. They're not going to risk themselves on a needless venture. And they felt that they didn't have that type of leadership, and that's why they fought as poorly as they did. Now, to add to the further distraction of the Army of the Potomac, the critics who go at Hooker are now going to find themselves moving around in all sorts of directions, looking for some kind of scapegoat for the Army's ills and woes. Officers are going to blame each other left and right. For example, Hooker is going to lay almost all of his burden on Howard's 11th Corps and how the Germans had run on May 2nd. He's going to blame John Sedgwick for being slow and not joining him at Chancellorsville, forgetting that part that he had left him abandoned in a lurch while the Army retreated. The reflections are terrible. Wainwright says that the attacks on General Howard are outrageous. So one can only imagine exactly how vehement these can be. Other officers are going to quickly get into the act. Carl Schurz of the 11th Corps is going to blame Howard for the lack of management. And then others in turn will blame Schurz for his problems until we get a malaise that overwhelms the Army and paralyzes it. As General Barlow writes at one point, the Corps is in a state of continuous excitement and quarreling. One Dutchman accuses another of misconduct in the late battle, and the Dutch accuse the Americans, and vice versa. I think Shorts is intriguing to get the command of the Corps and is trying insidiously to injure General Howard. But perhaps whistling in the cemetery, trying to reassure himself, he adds, I do not fear that he won't succeed in this venture. Others are also going to be quick to pick up on this. Oliver Otis Howard himself is going to write, everybody who is to blame is trying to shift the responsibility upon someone else's shoulders. Alpheus Williams of the 12th Corps is going to blame everybody around him, almost like a buckshot kind of mentality. I think this last battle has been the greatest of bunglings in this war. And I despair of ever accomplishing anything so long as the generals who are made as they have been stay with us. In fact, things seemed to slip until the entire army was immersed in a sticky, unseemly position. And Charles Francis Adams, once again, brings us back to Hooker, who he says at this point had reached the low point of his popularity. I can find no better way of putting this than Charles Francis Adams' way of saying that Hooker stood lower in the estimation of the army than ever did the redoubtable John Pope. The infamy of Second Manassas. Now, as bad as this is going to reflect a very important aspect of the battle coming. Because things could not have come at a worse time for the Army of the Potomac. To have their morale sink at this critical moment, as they come out of Chancellorsville and go into the summer of '63, this is the time when many of the enlistments in the Army of the Potomac have come up. The Army has been fed off of many different types of enlistments. Some soldiers have signed up for 3 years. Some have signed up for 2. Some have signed up for 9 months. And at this critical stage, the 9 months and the 2-year enlistment has come due. Joseph Hooker's army lost 17,000 casualties on the battlefield at Chancellorsville in May. Incidentally, that exceeds Burnside's fiasco at Fredericksburg by 4,000. Yet a greater loss to the Army, a more tremendous impact, will be these enlistments, because no one wants to re-enlist in an army they feel that is beat as bad as the Army of the Potomac. 23,000 Union soldiers will leave the ranks between the end of April and mid-June 1863. The Army of the Potomac is going to dwindle down from an impressive size of close to 125,000 to barely over 80,000. This will be the smallest that the Army of the Potomac has been in the field in any of its operations. Now, as the Army diminishes, one has to paint a quick view of the opposing army. Robert E. Lee's forces were in fact growing at this point. Not only had Longstreet's Corps been reunited with Lee for the summer, but many of the coastal defenses had been stripped down and troops sent to join Lee in his foray for the summer. So at one of those ironic moments, we see that the Army of the Potomac's numbers are going down and shrinking. The Army of Northern Virginia is rising. And suddenly, we're looking at two armies that have reached parity in relative numbers. That could also be a very daunting thing to look at if you're in the Army of the Potomac. Initially, Lincoln's impression was that Hooker should strike again and strike quickly. Chancellorsville is in the past. Let's move along. But the Army of the Potomac is in no shape to. And as they watch their numbers literally evaporate, Lincoln also changes his tone from one of aggressiveness, offensiveness, to now a prudent defense, as he begs Hooker just to keep Lee from creating havoc. He writes him a very simple, heartfelt message: keep the enemy at bay and out of other mischief. Hooker will not be able to do that. Lee is going to take advantage of his victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and his rise of sweeping momentum to drive northward. And Hooker will be unable to stop him. In fact, the truth be told, Hooker didn't even know where Lee was going or where Lee was at any given point. Convinced at first that Lee was still at Fredericksburg when his army had to Culpeper, he caught up with this idea rather late. As the Confederate Army proceeded towards the Shenandoah Valley, driving northeast, Hooker is again at a loss to explain where Lee is. This is going to be very frustrating to Lincoln in this critical time before Gettysburg, as he tries to work with an Army commander who is showing a great deal of problem finding his own opponent, and of focusing on his opponent, and of focusing on his ultimate objective. As the Confederate Army moves northward, Hooker's first impression was that I should move south, that I should strike at Richmond. Lee has to once again drag Hooker back to focus, pointing out that the true objective is not Richmond. The true objective is Lee's army, that you must find them. Now the question arises, where is Lee's army? As far as Hooker is concerned, it's Culpeper. But already Confederate forces have swooped down on Winchester and surrounded and captured the Union garrison under Robert Milroy. As these Confederates are strung out over a great deal of space, Hooker throws his hands up and has to admit freely he has lost the Confederate Army and doesn't know where they are. And it's Lincoln who is going to say that they are quite stretched out over a wide front, that there must be some soft underside to this, some weak point that he can strike at. Here is opportunity staring Hooker in the face, if this general is paralyzed and unable to take advantage of it. In fact, as Hooker slowly and reluctantly starts moving northward, trying to parallel this vague notion of where Lee's forces are heading, he's way behind them. Ultimately, he does catch up to a point where he takes an inside track between Washington and Lee's forces, and very adeptly has them in a defensive posture, but that's not good enough for Lincoln. Lincoln wants an offensive posture. Here's an opportunity to strike an army strung out on the road. He's thinking in the wrong direction, and ultimately, Lincoln has lost confidence himself in Joseph Hooker and has decided that this man cannot possibly lead an army into the battle again. As the Union Army presses northward, Lincoln is going to keep Hooker on a shorter and shorter leash, putting more and more pressure on him, giving him more and more along the lines of direct orders in how to perform his function, trying to make his position intolerable, in a sense. One of the things that has been a great perk for Hooker is that he doesn't have to deal with an arch nemesis, the General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck. In fact, he has gone in the face of the hierarchy of the Army and has communicated directly with Lincoln. And Lincoln has agreed to this. Lincoln has kept that channel of communications open. But by June 16th, we see Lincoln shut that down entirely and tells Hooker to go through Halleck. Something that Hooker has been arguing against from the very first day he assumed command. There's only one purpose to this, and that is to make it more difficult for Joseph Hooker and encourage him to lead the army. As they move north, Hooker wants reinforcements with an army that's dwindled down into the 80,000. Of course he wants reinforcements. He asks for those troops that are around the Washington defenses, and he's denied. He asks, ultimately, for the garrison at Harper's Ferry. At this point, he is again denied those troops. Hooker unwittingly provided Abraham Lincoln with what he wanted. Standing in Frederick on June 27, 1863, realizing he cannot have the garrison at Harper's Ferry, finding his position absolutely untenable as a commander, Joseph Hooker tries to throw weight around to influence Abraham Lincoln. He offers his resignation. Before he has a chance to even reconsider this, it is readily accepted. Dispatch from the War Department, James Hardee will arrive in the Army of the Potomac bivouacs early on the morning of June 28th. And he will awake George Gordon Meade, the commander of the 5th Corps, and place him in command by order of the President. George Gordon Meade didn't expect this. In fact, he, like everyone else, has been caught up in the bickering of the hierarchy. At one point, he even has to freely admit to his own wife, as to Hooker, he and I are now entirely at war with each other. they go back and forth and who was responsible for withdrawing the army from Chancellorsville. As Meade takes command of the army, one can obviously see that Joseph Hooker is overwhelmed, upset. One officer says Hooker feels the change deeply. And within the day, he leaves the army and quits the Army of the Potomac forever. As he leaves, George Gordon Meade assumes the command. George Meade has assumed a broken down, tired Army of the Potomac on the eve of battle. I can't think of anything more frightening for the Army of the Potomac at this time. Meade has been a capable officer. He's been actually a very aggressive officer. This idea, this picture we have of him being a very timid officer, very calculating, meticulous, to the point of trying to find excuses not to be aggressive, doesn't really hold water. In fact, he is a very aggressive officer, but a man who is also calculating about these and taking his best shots. As one officer says, Meade does not let grass grow under his feet. And he truly means that, and he shows it. He's been a corps commander only on one battle, at Chancellorsville, and there he was the advocate of the offense. Now he has assumed command of the army, with only one campaign under his belt as a corps commander. Prior to that, as a division commander or a brigade commander. This is a very lofty rise in command for him, and very swift. Just 6 months before, he had just been a division commander at Fredericksburg. Now he owns this army. And what he has is 8 corps under his command. And of those 8 corps commanders, 5 of them are just as new, if not newer, than he is, leaving only 3 veterans that he can rely on. This is something to think about. The Army is less than 72 hours away from battle. Now, as these troops go into Pennsylvania at the end of June and the beginning of July 1863, the Army has dwindled down to about 80,000 effective against Lee's forces of 70-some thousand effective. Yet, Meade doesn't dawdle for a moment. Less than 24 hours after taking command, the Army is moving north again, looking for Lee. On July 1st, they find him here. And to be perfectly blunt and honest, this is the single worst day in the history of the Army of the Potomac. And circumstanced a great deal, and often was the butt of jokes in the Army of the Potomac. He liked to have fanfare surround him. He feels very strongly about himself. The 5th Corps is commanded by the man who replaces George Meade, George Sykes. George Sykes is a very small man. One staff officer said that he had that look about him of constantly being tired and always being a little irritable. He was a man who also had a telltale nickname, Tardy George. To be fair to Tardy George, he has commanded a corps as many hours as George Meade has commanded an army. The 6th Corps is led by John Sedgwick, a round, garrulous man. Everyone loves Uncle John Sedgwick. He just has a warm air about him. The 11th Corps is led by the very pious Oliver Otis Howard. One soldier said that he was the most Christian man in the Army of the Potomac. He was also soft-spoken and quite small and quite young. His corps had been vested now in 2 back-to-back actions. He was killed in the pinch. He was very embarrassed. The 12th Corps should have been under Slocum, but since we've elevated Slocum to a higher command, it is now being led by a division commander, General Alpheus S. Williams. Not a professional soldier, but a man who has done very ably with the division, with the 12th Corps. And fortunately for us, is also a beautiful, magnificent literature. It gives great insights into this war. Now, as these soldiers are brought together at 9 o'clock at night, they're going to talk for many hours. They're going to talk about what has happened on the field, what has happened to their troops, and Meade is going to absorb the information that he didn't have for the War Department. That is, namely, what has the Army sustained, and what do we have left? At one point, Daniel Butterfield will take out a simple piece of paper and start writing down notes for what has transpired roughly in their conversations. And as he talks to the different corps commanders and brings up their numbers or their estimations of their numbers, they come up with the magic number that the Army of the Potomac now has 58,000 effectives left on the field. And this triggers a discussion on the three most important questions for the Army of the Potomac. Sometime near midnight, George Meade, who has not been saying much, who has just simply been listening to his corps commanders and getting the feel and the gist of what their thoughts were, decides to formalize it. We've often looked at the questions that Meade has asked at Gettysburg, and many others are going to manipulate these questions to tell us that he had no backbone, that he had no desire in staying at Gettysburg. He was not committed to the field. I would argue instead that he was very committed to the field, and all three questions are rhetorical. And they have all been discussed in the previous 3 hours before they were formalized. Daniel Butterfield will write down on a piece of paper the first question. Under the existing circumstances, is it advisable for this Army to remain in its present condition, or in its present position, or to retire to another nearer to its base of supplies? The question itself reveals the problem right away. Its base of supplies. This Army has 1 day's rations at best. Many of the corps don't even have that. If they stay, they will not be supplied with ammunition or food. And this is a critical question. Alpheus Williams tells us that this is perhaps the most important question, and one that should not be underestimated. And the Army is of like mind. They agree with me, who has already committed the Army to stay. They all say that the Army should stay at Gettysburg. Some have reservations about the position. John Newton, the engineer, can't help but notice that it's a poor position that can be easily flanked. But in the end, he votes that it stay, provided it can somehow fix the line, or at least anticipate the flanking movement. Gibbon has to agree with this, and the others, in fact, all agree that the Army should stay. Now, the next question is, since the Army has decided to stay, should the Army maintain a defensive stance or an offensive stance? Again, going back to Meade's dispatch to the War Department, that was what he needed to determine, whether he could be offensive rather than defensive. And to a man, the Corps commanders had decided that it would be best to stay on the defense. Of course, Howard, perhaps feeling that his Corps had been vested now on 2 fields, wanted to show some kind of assertion. He wanted to put a proviso. Instead of just staying on the defensive, we should stay on the defensive to a certain time, ideally 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 3rd. And if we're not attacked, maybe we should attack. It brings up a kind of tantalizing thought in George Meade's view, and it provokes a third question. When should we convene again to decide the next move of the Army of the Potomac? And all of them agreed in 1 day. So at the end of the 3rd, if they are not attacked, then they must either consider attacking or now considering falling back to their supplies again. But I think it's interesting as we look at the 3 questions and the answers that everyone is of like mind, including George Meade. This Army is committed to the field. It is committed to staying at Gettysburg. It is committed to dealing with Robert E. Lee's forces. As things close up, Meade is heard to say, such then is the decision, which he could have added, which has already been made. He agrees with this entirely, even writing to his wife the next morning in fine spirits that we had a great fight yesterday, and today at it again. The Army is in fine spirits, and as he sums up the moment from last night, and everyone is determined to do or die. As the Army commanders left the Eastern House and went back to their different commands, John Gibbon stops to talk to Meade for a few moments, apologizing for being a mere division commander when his corps commander was right there. I almost do the same with Greg Mertz standing right here. That he felt that maybe he wasn't supposed to be at this meeting, that his corps was already represented by Hancock. But Meade was unusually kind and very open, said, no, I wanted you to. Adding with a very interesting insight. He said that if Lee attacks tomorrow, he will attack on your front. Now, Gibbon was kind of startled by this revelation and had to ask why Meade thought that, and Meade was very quick to answer, because he has made attacks on both my flanks, and he's failed. And if he concludes to try it again, it will be on our center. So already he is anticipating the attack. He's anticipating July 3rd. And even with the anticipation, the firm conviction to stay is well rooted. As he said, the Army is ready to do or die, as out in the future of the Army of the Potomac. And unlike 1 month before in Chancellorsville, this time, the Army and its commanders were of like mind. The Army of the Potomac would stay and would fight it out.